After years in the shadow of Daystar's controversies, Jonathan and Suzy Lamb have finally stepped forward with an announcement that's sending shockwaves through the Christian community. Their decision to launch a brand new ministry marks a bold new chapter, one that promises transparency, healing, and a break from the past. But is this the fresh start so many have been waiting for? Or just the beginning of another storm? The truth behind their move may surprise you. Jonathan Lamb's story begins in the middle of a world already shaped by cameras, microphones, and the steady hum of Christian broadcasting. He wasn't just a child growing up in a quiet neighborhood. He was the son of Marcus and Joni Lamb, the founders of Daystar, one of the most influential Christian television networks in the world. From the beginning, ministry wasn't just something his family talked about on Sundays. It was their daily life, their mission, and their identity. For Jonathan, the legacy of Daystar was everywhere. As a boy, he would often be seen in the studio halls where bright lights and busy crews were just part of the atmosphere. While other kids might have grown up around football fields or playgrounds, Jonathan's backdrop was cameras, control rooms, and the constant flow of people preparing shows that would reach millions of viewers. He was surrounded by faith, but also by the reality of what it meant to run a global network. Every broadcast carried the weight of both ministry and business, and Jonathan had a front-row seat to it all. When he appeared on screen for the first time, viewers noticed. He didn't seem nervous or out of place. He had a calm way of speaking, something steady in his tone that made people listen. As he grew older, that presence only deepened. Viewers began to recognize his face, not just as Marcus and Joni's son, but as someone who could connect with an audience on his own. For many, it seemed natural to imagine that Jonathan would one day help carry the vision of Daystar into the future. Suzy entered his life with her own story and her own strengths. Unlike Jonathan, she didn't grow up in the middle of television studios, but she brought something different to the table. She had a gentle warmth that people immediately noticed, a way of speaking that made others feel safe and understood. When she and Jonathan stood together, their balance was clear. He carried the steady voice of tradition, and she carried the open-hearted kindness that made ministry feel personal. Together, they looked like the future of the Lamb family legacy. Being part of Daystar was never just a job. It was a responsibility to millions of people who tuned in every day. Families across the world didn't just see the Lambs as broadcasters, they saw them as spiritual leaders, people who carried their trust in prayers. Jonathan and Suzy knew that every time they stepped onto a stage, sat in a studio, or spoke to viewers, they weren't only representing themselves, they were carrying the Lamb name, a name tied to decades of ministry work and influence. The weight of that legacy was heavy, but for a long time, they carried it with grace. Jonathan and Suzy became a natural part of Daystar's rhythm. They didn't just appear on shows, they worked behind the scenes, attended events, and learned how the network functioned from the inside out. They saw the effort it took to produce programs, the decisions made about which voices to feature, and the delicate balance of running a ministry that was also a global business. It gave them a rare perspective, not just the spotlight, but the hard work behind it. To viewers at home, their presence became familiar, even comforting. Jonathan's thoughtful approach and Suzy's gentle encouragement made them feel approachable. They weren't only the children of founders or faces on television, they were people that families trusted, people who represented continuity in a ministry that had already touched millions of lives. As the years went by, it seemed almost certain that Jonathan and Suzy would take on more leadership, becoming the bridge between the foundation Marcus and Joni had built and the future waiting to be shaped. Growing up in the legacy of Daystar meant Jonathan never really had a normal childhood or young adulthood. Every step was tied to something bigger than himself. The ministry wasn't just his parents' work. It was a living, breathing mission that shaped his identity. For Suzy, stepping into that world meant embracing the same responsibility. Together, they carried a sense of destiny, whether they asked for it or not. And for many watching, it was clear. Jonathan and Suzy weren't just part of the Daystar story, they were its future. As Jonathan and Suzy Lamb grew into their roles at Daystar, their influence became impossible to ignore. At first, they were simply familiar faces, children of the founders who occasionally appeared on programs or joined their parents on stage. But slowly, something began to change. They weren't just filling space anymore. They were finding their voices, and the audience was listening. Jonathan, with his calm and steady way of speaking, developed a natural rhythm that drew people in. He didn't need flashy words or big gestures to make an impact. His style was thoughtful, almost quiet, but it carried weight. Viewers noticed how he could take complicated topics, faith, culture, even daily struggles, and explain them in ways that felt simple and approachable. For younger audiences, especially those who didn't always connect with traditional church voices, Jonathan felt different. He wasn't preaching at them, he was talking with them. That sense of connection became his strength. Suzy, on the other hand, brought a gentler but equally powerful presence. She often focused on encouragement, family life, and relationships. When she spoke, people felt as if they were being seen and understood. Women admired her honesty, younger viewers appreciated her openness, and many families related to her stories about daily challenges. Suzy didn't try to be the loudest voice in the room, but when she spoke, people leaned in. Her kindness became a kind of anchor for many who were searching for something real and relatable. Together, Jonathan and Suzy formed a balance that Daystar hadn't seen before. His thoughtful presence, combined with her warmth, created a partnership that felt authentic. They weren't competing for attention, they complemented each other, and the audience felt it. It wasn't long before they were no longer just Marcus and Joni's kids, they were Jonathan and Suzy leaders in their own right. Behind the scenes, their influence was growing just as quickly. They weren't only appearing on camera. They were involved in events, gatherings, and planning sessions. They began to understand the machinery that kept Daystar running, from production schedules to program choices. The more they learned, the more responsibility they carried. Staff members saw them stepping into roles that mattered. Viewers saw them becoming part of the network's core identity, and slowly, people began to imagine a future where Jonathan and Suzy might one day lead the ministry completely. For the audience, this shift felt natural. Jonathan had the steady voice of a leader, and Suzy had the compassion to connect with hearts. Together, they represented continuity. They were the bridge between the founders who had built the ministry from the ground up and the next generation who would take it into the future. Many viewers believed the Lamb legacy was safe in their hands. What made their rise even more powerful was the fact that they seemed relatable. Jonathan and Suzy weren't distant celebrities. They appeared approachable, open, and human. They shared parts of their own lives, talked about struggles, and showed that faith wasn't just about perfect answers. It was about walking through life with trust, even when it was messy. For viewers who had grown weary of polished performances, Jonathan and Suzy felt different. They felt real. This authenticity helped cement their role as more than just background figures. They began to shape the image of Daystar itself. Their presence reminded people that the ministry wasn't only about the past, it was also about what was coming next. Jonathan and Suzy became symbols of that transition. Evidence that Daystar could continue through a new generation without losing its heart. The recognition they received was unlike anything most people their age experienced. They were young, yet they carried the trust of millions. Viewers wrote letters, sent messages, and spoke about how much Jonathan and Suzy had impacted them personally. Their faces became part of the network's identity, and their words shaped conversations in homes across the world. By this point, it wasn't just about carrying a family name. Jonathan and Suzy were carving their own path. They had their own style, their own voices, and their own following. People didn't just expect to see them, they looked forward to it. When they spoke, viewers felt like the next chapter of Daystar was already being written before their eyes. But with greater influence came greater pressure. Being at the center of such a large ministry meant their decisions, their words, and even their silence carried weight. Every program they hosted, every event they attended, became part of the public image of the network. Still, they carried that responsibility with grace. They seemed to understand that their role wasn't just about building their own reputation. It was about honoring the legacy of Marcus and Joni, while also creating space for something new. For many years, it seemed as though the path was clear. Jonathan and Suzy would continue to rise, continue to take on more responsibility, and eventually step fully into leadership. They had the background, the skills, and the support of an audience that trusted them. Their future at Daystar felt secure, almost inevitable. To many, it looked like only a matter of time before Jonathan and Suzy became the central figures guiding the network into a new era. Looking back, it's easy to see why so many believed this. They weren't just filling roles handed to them. They were stepping into their own identities as leaders, building trust through authenticity and shaping the future through their voices. For Jonathan and Suzy, the promise of tomorrow seemed bright. Their influence was undeniable, and their future at Daystar looked stronger than ever. Behind the cameras, the bright lights, and the polished smiles, life at Daystar was more complicated than it looked. For years, viewers saw Jonathan and Suzy as rising leaders, the couple who would carry the Lamb family's ministry into the next generation. On screen, everything seemed calm and steady. But behind the scenes, tensions had been quietly building, and those tensions would eventually push Jonathan and Suzy toward one of the hardest decisions of their lives. At first, the disagreements were small. Jonathan and Suzy had fresh ideas about reaching younger audiences and making Daystar more relatable in a changing world. They wanted to create programming that spoke directly to the questions younger believers were asking about culture, family, and faith in daily life. They believed that to keep growing, the ministry had to speak in a language that new generations could understand, but not everyone agreed. Some inside the network were committed to keeping things exactly as they had been, holding tightly to the methods that had built Daystar's success in the first place. These differences in vision might sound simple, but inside a family ministry they carried enormous weight. Daystar wasn't just a television network, it was the Lamb family's mission and identity. Questioning the way things were run could easily be seen as questioning the family itself. For Jonathan and Suzy, this was a painful line to walk. They respected the legacy of Marcus and Joni Lamb, but they also felt the responsibility to think about the future. They weren't trying to tear anything down, they were trying to prepare for what was ahead. As the months passed, small disagreements turned into harder conversations. Meetings became tense, and what once felt like family discussions began to feel more like battles over direction. Jonathan tried to explain his perspective with calm reasoning, while Suzy stood by his side, adding her voice when she felt it was needed. But even with their steady approach, the atmosphere grew heavy. What started as private debates slowly became a weight that everyone around them could feel. To the outside world, nothing seemed wrong. Daystar's programs continued, the broadcasts ran smoothly, and Jonathan and Suzy still appeared on screen, smiling as always. Viewers had no reason to think anything had changed, but for those working close to the family, the cracks were becoming harder to ignore. The unity people assumed was there had started to weaken. It wasn't just about what shows to produce or what topics to cover. It was about who would lead Daystar into the future and whose vision would define the ministry. For Jonathan and Suzy, the pressure was intense. They had always been seen as the next generation of leaders, but now it was clear that their ideas didn't fully align with the main leadership of the network. The more they pushed for new approaches, the more resistance they faced. It wasn't an open fight, but the quiet disagreements were just as exhausting. Every meeting, every conversation seemed to carry more weight. It became harder to imagine a future where their vision and the direction of Daystar could exist side by side. Eventually, the differences became too big to ignore. After many months of discussions and growing tension, the decision was made. Jonathan and Suzy would no longer be part of Daystar. When the news first broke, it shocked the audience. Viewers who had grown used to seeing their familiar faces were suddenly asking, "Where did they go? Why aren't they on the programs anymore?" The absence was immediate, and the questions spread quickly. For Jonathan and Suzy, leaving Daystar was deeply painful. This wasn't just a job or a platform, it was their family's mission, a part of their identity since childhood. Walking away meant letting go of something that had shaped nearly every part of their lives. But at the same time, they knew staying would mean silencing their own voices and setting aside the vision they believed God had given them. It was not a decision made lightly, but it was one they felt was necessary. The public reaction was divided. Many viewers who loved Jonathan and Suzy were heartbroken to see them go. They praised the couple's kindness, humility, and steady presence, hoping they would find a way to continue their ministry in a new form. These supporters saw their departure as a loss not only for Daystar but for the wider Christian community. Others, however, sided with Daystar's leadership, saying change in direction was sometimes necessary and that ministries couldn't survive without strong, centralized authority. For Jonathan and Suzy, it was hard to watch people debate their lives so openly. Their story became a constant topic in church groups, on social media, and in living room conversations. People speculated, argued, and tried to piece together the reasons for their exit. But instead of hiding, Jonathan and Suzy chose to speak honestly about their journey. They admitted that leaving had not been what they imagined for their future, but they also said the challenges along the way had made it clear it was time to move forward. They didn't frame their departure as a defeat. Instead, they spoke about it as a turning point, a moment where God was leading them away from the old and into something new. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without sadness, but they believed it was the right step. In the weeks and months after their exit, the conversations about them didn't fade. Friends, supporters, and even critics continued to talk about what their departure meant for the Lamb family legacy and for the future of Daystar. In the middle of all this noise, Jonathan and Suzy began to quietly prepare for the next chapter. Their time at Daystar had ended, but their calling hadn't. They knew that walking away from the network didn't mean walking away from ministry. If anything, it gave them the chance to build something that reflected their own values and vision more clearly. The story of their exit was not just about leaving a television network. It was about the painful reality of change, the challenges of carrying a family legacy, and the courage it takes to step into the unknown. Jonathan and Suzy's decision showed that sometimes the hardest choice, to walk away from what feels secure, is the one that opens the door to a new beginning. When Jonathan and Suzy Lamb walked away from Daystar, many people thought they might step back completely from public ministry. The weight of leaving their family's network was heavy, and no one would have been surprised if they had chosen to disappear for a while, to heal in private and stay out of the spotlight. But Jonathan and Suzy didn't see their exit as the end of their calling. For them, it was the beginning of something new, a fresh start, one not defined by the old system, but by their own vision for what ministry could look like. At first, there was silence. Viewers noticed they were gone from the screen, and questions swirled. Some wondered if they had given up. Others speculated about what had happened behind the scenes. Jonathan and Suzy didn't rush to explain themselves. They took time to think, to pray, and to understand what God was asking them to do next. That quiet season became the ground where their new ministry began to take root. When they finally began to speak about their future, their message was clear. They weren't finished. They still believed deeply in the power of faith, encouragement, and family. They wanted to continue sharing hope with people, but in a way that wasn't tied to the politics and pressures of a massive network. They wanted something simpler, something closer to the heart. Their new ministry would not be about flashing lights, global broadcasts, or carrying the weight of a family empire. It would be about connection. For Jonathan, this new chapter was a chance to speak more directly and personally. He had always been thoughtful in the way he communicated, but now he could do it without the filter of a network, deciding what should or shouldn't be said. He began focusing on life, faith, and the daily struggles people face in a way that was more open and unpolished. His goal was to reach both young and old, showing that faith isn't just about Sunday sermons. It's about how you live every day, in your family, at work, and in your private battles. Suzy stepped into this fresh start with her quiet strength. She continued to focus on the themes that had always resonated with people: family life, encouragement, and trust in God during hard times. She didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. Her impact came through her warmth and her willingness to be honest about life's challenges. Many women and families who had once connected with her on Daystar followed her into this new chapter, grateful that she hadn't disappeared after the exit. Together, Jonathan and Suzy began to build their ministry brick by brick. It wasn't about recreating Daystar on a smaller scale. It was about doing something different. They used smaller platforms, social media, podcasts, live gatherings, to connect with people in ways that felt more personal. They wanted to break down the barrier that television sometimes created, and instead create a space where people could feel like they were sitting across the table, having a real conversation. Supporters welcomed this change. Many who had admired Jonathan and Suzy on Daystar felt even closer to them now because the new ministry felt authentic. It wasn't polished with glossy sets or filled with scripted lines. It was real, it was raw, and it was theirs. For people who had lost trust in large ministries after so many scandals and disappointments, Jonathan and Suzy's new approach felt refreshing. Of course, starting over wasn't easy. They didn't have the massive resources of a global network anymore. They didn't have the same reach or platform. But what they did have was the trust of people who believed in them. And trust, once earned, can carry more weight than the biggest stage. Bit by bit, their new ministry began to grow. It wasn't explosive growth, but steady and faithful. Exactly the kind of work they had always believed in. Leaving Daystar had been a loss, but in that loss, they found freedom. They no longer had to fight internal battles over vision or direction. They no longer had to worry about carrying the entire Lamb legacy on their shoulders. Instead, they could focus on being themselves, speaking honestly, and following the path they believed God had placed in front of them. Their story quickly became more than just a ministry update. It became a lesson about resilience and faith. Life had forced them to make a hard choice, But they didn't let that choice silence them. Instead, they showed what it means to begin again. Many of their supporters saw their story as an encouragement for their own lives. If Jonathan and Suzy could walk away from something so big and start fresh, maybe others could find the strength to face their own changes too. Today, their work looks different than it did before, but the heart of it remains the same: to bring hope, to speak truth, and to encourage people in their faith. Their journey is proof that ministry doesn't end when a platform ends. It can continue in new ways, sometimes stronger than before. Jonathan and Suzy's fresh start is not just about survival. It's about growth, courage, and the belief that God can create new beginnings, even when the old chapter closes.